Hello, everybody, and welcome to Mrs. G's Story Time. And we are reading Secret at Pheasant Cottage by Patricia Sanjan with permission of Moody Publishing Company. And we are reading Chapter 6, Badger Watching, with Don and Mr. Smith. We went home, and Don, after having a bun and a cup of tea, bicycled away into the dusk as usual. But once again, something had happened. Something. Through that single sentence of Don's, I suddenly knew what to do. All my confused sense of right and wrong, my wondering who to stay loyal to, seemed to have come to rest in that one sentence, as though it were a compass pointing me home. Somehow I must find my father, or wait till he found me, and tell him that whatever he'd done, I was still his girl. For the first time, I felt I was really starting out in the right direction instead of running around in circles. For the first time since I read that letter, I fell asleep the moment my head touched the pillow. It was 2 days later, on Good Friday, that Gran and Grandpa and I went to the service in the little Norman church nearby, its gray walls now surrounded by a sea of golden daffodils. I quite liked going to church. I liked wearing my best clothes and singing hymns, and I loved the musty smell and the simple beauty of the arches and the pillars. During the sermon, I usually made up stories while Grandpa snoozed and Gran listened. That day, though, it was a different sort of service. There was no sermon, just hymns and prayers, and I found myself listening, really listening. And then we sang a hymn I'd known since I was small, and I found myself thinking, really thinking, about the words. He died that we might be forgiven. He died to make us good. If that was true, bad people could change. Even prisoners could be forgiven. And while I was still thinking this out, the service ended, and we streamed out of that cool church into the green and the gold of the April morning. I wondered what it was like to come out of prison, to be forgiven. I walked home very quietly, still thinking hard. That afternoon, I helped Grandpa in the garden. I felt I needed to found out everything I could from him, and besides, I liked talking to Grandpa. Did my mother like gardening, Grandpa? I began. Well, now, I don't think she did much. She loved wild growing things and wandered about, but she liked reading better than working in the garden. Our Alice was one great one for book learning. And I really like her, Grandpa? He smiled very tenderly. You might be her all over again, pretending to do a bit of weeding and sitting back and talking instead. That was her way. It was Dad this and Dad that. I never got any work done when she was about. But aren't I like my father, Grandpa? Surely you can't be like only one parent. Her smile faded. I don't think you'd like him at all. You're like him at all, Lucy. And even if you are, he paused. I'm trying to think of the right words. It's like this, or so it seems to me. If you cross a weak plant with a healthy plant, and then you take the seedlings and give them manure and water them and shelter them and keep the slugs off of them, well, they'll grow up to be healthy plants. The weak strand will die out. We've tried to give you plenty of sunshine and shelter, Lucy. And you've kept the slugs off me, I added with a giggle. But Grandpa, don't bad people ever turn good? I mean, don't people ever change? Grandpa considered this for a long time. Well, he said at last, leaning on his spade, even the Bible says something about not gathering grapes with the thistles. Flowers are flowers and weeds are weeds. But people can change by the grace of God. But prison's a poor soil, Lucy. They mostly come out worse than they went in. But there is the grace of God. You'd better ask your Gran about it. He gave a deep sigh and stooped to his seedlings, and I sighed too, pulling up a few more weeds. Grandpa's answers had given me little hope or comfort. Then I glanced up and noticed a heap of manure beside the tool shed and gave a little cry of pleasure. 2 white narcissus appeared to be springing out of it, such beautiful flowers out of such dirty, smelly manure. I said to myself, it's like the grace of God. Ugly things can turn beautiful. I think bad people can become good. I saw little Don after Easter. for he had been very busy helping his father, saving up for his new bike. He had earned quite a lot of money by taking luggage up to the elevator and working in the garden, cleaning the car, and running errands for Mr. Smith. "Who's Mr. Smith?" I asked casually. It was a warm, sleepy afternoon, and Don and I sat dangling our feet in the pool, drinking our tea and exchanging news. The daffodils were nearly over, and soon the bluebells would come out. Mr. Smith, explained Don with his mouth full, was a new man who'd come to live at the hotel about 10 days before. He'd taken an attic room and was going to stay until summer. He was a nice man who traveled in a lot of countries. He'd been in an avalanche and seen a bullfight, but he wasn't very strong, and he'd had a bad cough. Don liked talking to him, but it wasn't allowed to disturb him much because he was always busy. "What does he do?" I asked. "He writes books," replied Don casually. "He's got a whole shelf of them, but he won't let me read them. He says, 'Write books,'" I gasped. "Do you mean to say he writes real books to be printed and people read them?" "Of course. What else would you do with books? Eat them?" I gazed at Don in wonder, and he ran errands for a real live author whose books were printed. I thought of all the notebooks in my bedroom filled with pages of happy scribbles. But would I ever write anything that could be printed? And who would tell me how to set about it? "I'd like to meet Mr. Smith," I said boldly. "Actually," replied Don, "he'd like to meet you. I told him how you wrote stories and poems and things, and he said he was interested in children who wrote things, and he'd like to see some of your pieces. Perhaps he'll come up to the woods with me one day when he's better, but I won't be coming for a few days. Dad thinks there's some badgers in the little woods off of the Turksferry Road, and we're going there to watch. They come out when it's getting dark." "Wish I could see them," I said. "Okay," said Don good-naturedly, "but you can't come until I know they exist. If they are really there, we'll try and fix something. And badgers are worth seeing." He was as good as his word. He came pedaling up the hill, very breathless and excited, about 5 days later, and burst into the kitchen where Gran and I were spending a peaceful afternoon baking for the church fete. "Please, Mrs. Ferguson," he announced, "can Lucy come? Mom says she can have tea with us at home, and then she can come and see the badgers. We saw hundreds of them, Mrs. Ferguson. Well, we saw at least 7. It was pitch dark, and we watched them dancing and boxing." "May I ask how in the pitch dark?" asked Gran, smiling. "Well, it got pitch dark as we watched," explained Don. "It was pitch dark coming home in the car. When we first saw them, it was sunset, and the sky was all red, and for ages we waited for them to come. You have to keep very, very still, Lucy. You mustn't move for an hour." It must be very difficult for you," remarked Gran, for Don could never keep still. "And who's going with you? Your father will take you and bring Lucy back, will he?" Don shook his head. "Dad's busy tonight," he explained. "He's got lots of guests. Mr. Smith said he'll come with us. He's got a car, and he'll bring Lucy back by 9. Okay, Mrs. Ferguson?" "Oh, what fantastic cakes. Are you having a party, Mrs. Ferguson?" "Not really," smiled Miss Gran, "but perhaps we'll have one now. Sit down, you two, and have some cake and lemonade. I want to have a word with Grandpa." She was gone for quite a while, and I discovered later that she had sent Grandpa hurrying off to check up on Mr. Smith from Don's parents. As he seemed to be satisfied in every way, she returned at last and gave permission for me to go. I was wildly excited, already standing with one foot on the pedal of my bike, but whether it was because I was going to see a badger or meet a real live author, I was not quite sure. Then we were off, speeding under the larch trees, and I remember thinking there was no joy in the world like the joy of going downhill on a bicycle, with the wind singing in my ears and my hair blowing backwards. At the bottom of the hill, we skimmed into town and pushed our bicycles across the cobbles of the old marketplace between the overhanging timbered houses. Don's hotel lay at the far end, and we went around the back to his parents' flat. "Here's Lucy, Mom," said Don abruptly, disappearing into the next room and leaving me smiling shyly at a stout, comfortable-looking woman who greeted me with a smile just like Don's. She told me to sit down while she finished getting tea ready. We were having it early because of the badgers, whose habits had to be timed very carefully. so I sat on the sofa while Don rushed around making preparations for the expedition. You'd have thought we were going to the North Pole from the fuss that he was making. Then suddenly the door opened and a voice said quietly, "So you are Lucy, who writes poetry." "Good evening, Lucy. I'm Mr. Smith." I leaped to my feet and then tried hard not to show my disappointment. I don't know what I expected an author to look like, but certainly not like the man in the doorway. Tall and thin, with the bowed shoulders, bald on the top of his head, and with a general look of weariness and ill health. But I recovered myself quickly, for his face was very kind, and he looked at me with real interest. I smiled and shook hands, and he told me I was Lucy. I told him I was Lucy, that I did write stories and poems and things that they weren't very good. "They'll improve if you just keep writing," said Mr. Smith. "You must bring them here one day and let me see them." "I believe it's tea time now. I'm invited too, as it's a sort of Badger celebration party. Let's go in together." It really was a party, with ham and salad, fruit, ice cream, and cake. Don's dad made all sorts of jokes, and we laughed so much that it was nearly nearing sunset when Mr. Smith, Don, and I finally set off in a great hurry, armed with a flashlight and binoculars and peppermints and a rug for Mr. Smith, as he wasn't very strong. It was about a 20-minute drive through the country lanes, but I hardly noticed where we were going because Mr. Smith started talking to me about the books and poems I'd read, almost as though I were his equal. I found myself talking too, as I'd never talked to any other grown-up before, until I remembered poor Don in the back, who was bouncing up and down and dying to tell us all about badgers. "They have their babies down in the sits about February," he began, when he could get a word in edgewise. "Here, this is where we stop, Mr. Smith, up this little lane. You can leave the car in front of the farm. We go across the field, through that woods, and then we'll have to hide in the nettle patch, and the sit is just under those bushes. You'll need that rug, Mr. Smith, because of your cough." Don was hurrying across the field where the daisies were almost already closing their petals. As we approached the nettle patch, he went down on all fours and motioned for us to follow. We crept through the nettles and the brambles like red Indians stalking their quarry until we found ourselves in a rather uncomfortable little hollow, where we crouched and tried not to scratch our nettle stings. It was rather cold and the dew was falling. I'm sure Mr. Smith was longing to light a cigarette, but Don had already explained that was absolutely forbidden, as the badgers would almost certainly catch the scent and decide to spend the evening at home. We lay so still that we could hear all sorts of unfamiliar little sounds: the flight of wings as birds flew home, the thud of a rabbit's back legs in the field behind us. It was getting dark, and I suddenly felt glad that Mr. Smith was with us. Don was leaning forward, breathless and absorbed, and then it happened. A rustle in the dead leaves, black nose with a gleaming white streak, and a large badger rose up in the dusk, sniffing the air. It bounded a few paces, and then another appeared, and then they turned face to face and rose on their hind legs in a kind of slow twilight dance. Then another and another, an old fat badger, then two small, round, playful cubs, turning about clumsily. We watched like statues till the light had gone, and there was nothing more to be seen or heard but the ghostly shapes and queer little coughs and sniffles and the rustling of the dead leaves. Then Mr. Smith sneezed, and in 1 second we were all alone with that chilly night and the damp ditch and the stinging nettles. "I'm so sorry," said Mr. Smith. "Don't worry," said Don generously. "It's too dark to see them anymore in case. Wow, I'm really aching. Weren't they fantastic, Mr. Smith? Aren't you glad you came, Lucy? Bet you never saw anything as good as that before. Here, have a peppermint, everybody, to warm you up. Don't step in that cowpat, Mr. Smith. Race me to the gate, Lucy." He was in high spirits and chattered the whole way home, and I only half listened. I knew I would never forget that evening as long as I lived. We had reached my gate, and the moon was flooding the garden, making Grandpa's prized tulips look like pale lanterns. "Good night, Lucy," said Mr. Smith. And tomorrow, write about tonight. Write about the birds flying home and the smell of the wet grass. Write about what you felt when the first badger appeared. Write about the moonlight on the tulips. Write it all and let me see it. All right, I said, jumping out of the car. I'll try. Good night, and thank you very much. They left me standing at the gate, wondering how Mr. Smith knew that was exactly what I was going to do anyway. Tomorrow we'll be reading Chapter 7, The Adventure Begins. I love you, I'm praying for you, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.